All right, welcome everybody. Welcome back to our channel. This is week number 2. We're here with Pat and myself here going through our, actually the second week of chapters through the, the Real Estate Principles book here. So we're on to chapter number 6. We're hopefully going to get to chapter number 11. And I think that's it for today. Yeah, Pat, how you doing today?
I'm doing outstanding, sir. I'm looking forward to our power hour together, bringing you up to speed on anything I can bring you up to speed on.
Sounds good, brother. All right, so let's start off. Okay, chapter number 6 starts off with what's called the trust fund overview. So my first question for you is, what is a trust fund?
What is a trust fund? Right. It's a really important thing to know in our business. Basically, a broker will have 2 funds. Okay, they'll have a working account, which is, could be a general fund, and then they'll have a trust fund account, which is specific to funds that you receive from the principal. So we refer to our clients as a principal, correct?
Right.
So if you are receiving funds if you're writing an offer with someone and they give you a check to hold, you would log that in a trust fund book in the broker's office, and that money would go into if it were to go into a bank, then it would go into that specific trust fund that deposits are kept in. Okay. Okay. So trust funds, it's a really big comprehensive word. In our business, it refers to a lot of things. For example, only brokers can have a trust fund. As an agent, we couldn't have a trust fund, right? We can't handle money like that as agent capacity. Only a broker can. So, but it is basically, it's funds that you receive from your principal. Nowadays in the real world, on the RPA, we don't even take checks anymore. Back in the day when I first got into the real estate sales side over 20 years ago, we would take checks from people and we would send an offer, we'd make a copy of that check and we'd send it to the agent. Nowadays, the RPA, the Residential Purchase Agreement, you can check a box that just says the $25,000 deposit that we're going to be opening this escrow with will be wired into escrow within 3 days. So we don't even take those funds anymore. But it's basically just funds that you receive from a principal, which is your client in any deal.
Okay, so the broker handles the broker.
Correct. And a trust fund can be basically this. It can be, it could be a file, and you take the check, you write it in the trust fund book. Trust funds received on this date from this person, this check number, and then it goes in a file. Boom. And that's kept in the broker's office, right? Doesn't even go into a bank account, but they are trust funds that you receive that are kept in the office. And it used to be back in the old days, when you did reach mutual agreement, you would take that check and either give it back to your client who'd give you another check, or you would take that check and deposit it to escrow.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Okay, next thing. Next question is, what does conversion mean in regards to a trust fund?
Yeah, conversion. That would be a big problem for you. That would be if you did have money in a bank account, funds that you put on deposit, and you converted that money into your personal use. That's why it's best for a broker to maintain 2 bank accounts, a general account and a trust account, right? So all monies that go into the trust account are logged. You know exactly the funds that are in there based on the deposits that went in. And the only reason it would go out would be to go into escrow. Whereas a general account would be a working account where you're paying commissions, you're paying for marketing, you're paying whatever it may be, office supplies. So if conversion were to take place, that trust funds would be used by you or the broker for means other than a deposit. That would be a problem.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, next question from that chapter is, what is a general account?
Right, and I just touched on that a little bit. The general account would be, a broker has a general account that monies would be in, basically a business operating account.
Okay, so those are the 2 different accounts you were talking about, right? So the trust fund account and then the general account.
General account, yes, and the general account would be basically a working account. Office supplies, any other commissions come in, go into that account. Broker pulls his share out, he pays you your share. If the broker pays for any marketing for the office, whatever it may be, general working account would be that account.
Okay, makes sense. All right, sounds good. Okay, let's go on to chapter number 7. So chapter number 7, the heading for that chapter is Civil Rights and Fair Housing Laws. So the first question is, what is the FFHA? So it stands for Federal Fair Housing Act.
Right. That's on a federal level. Again, in the real world, it affects us every day, of course. In the workings of our business, knowing it intimately, not really. The basis of it is, of course, discrimination. The government passed that, the federal government, they passed it on a federal level to not discriminate based on race, religion, sexual orientation, whatever it may be, right? Prohibits that based on that law that was passed.
Okay. Okay, so the next three things in this chapter probably have to do with that same sensibility of non-discrimination. But I guess I'd ask you these because it will help me kind of ingrain this understanding. So
yes.
What is steering?
Steering in a real estate transaction would be kind of self-explanatory, right? Steering, you'd be moving someone towards or away from an area but in this case, in the discrimination chapter that you're talking about, based on identity, right? If your perception as a white person moving somebody into an overtly black area or an area where a high density of Asian population may be, and you were to say steer someone either towards that or away from that, it's that's what steering would be in that scenario that we're talking about.
Okay, so when you're talking to a client about where they want to, what kind of area they want to move into, I mean, that has to be, I would imagine that has to be sometimes a discussion. Like people are kind of like, maybe that might not say overtly, but would you get a sensibility that someone's like, I want to live in this kind of area, you know what I mean? I mean, that's a very, I understand the reason for what steering is and how it would be, how you shouldn't do something like this. But it would make sense that sometimes your clientele are you can probably sense from the way that they're talking about things in their life that they want to live in this kind of area where these kind of, ethnicities live. Does that happen?
I would say yes. I mean, it hasn't happened in my situation with in regards to race or anything like that. What happens with me mostly has to do with schools. People ask me about schools. Hey, I want to be in this school district. Where's the boundary for this district? If those questions ever come up about sexual identity, race, or any of these things, you just can't get into that conversation with them. Right. You can't be involved with any of that. It's just like, your license is on the line, and if somebody mentions that to you, that's, a judgment you're going to have to make with working with somebody. If they were to try and tell you, keep me away from this or move me towards that or something. It's never happened to me in the real world on a deal. Like I said, what happens to me all the time is, or not all the time, but a lot of the time has to do with schooling. I want to be in that district. I want to make sure that house is in that boundary for that school. It happens so much, and you'll find that happen with you all the time, especially, of course, when you're working with families. I mean, single folks, not as much. But I have had single folks also say, I'd rather be in this area. There's less kids based on what I've seen in my workings through that area. And so I like that. There's some areas that are, just full of families, right? And so a single person may not want to be in that environment. They have 55 and over housing tracts, right? And, you cannot, a 30-year-old can't buy in there. You have to be 55 and older, and they have limitations like that. So, but the race is a big deal. And if somebody mentions that and tries to move you in that direction, you may want to exit stage right.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, it's so as far as going schooling is concerned, you can recommend different schooling zones for different things.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so that doesn't fall under the category of any kind of discrimination going on then, right?
No, I mean, that's very specific, right? They're being very, very specific about what they want. They may say, look, we've looked at these two schools. This school ranks much higher on test scores than this school. And so I've had that happen many, many, many times, that they have to be in a specific school district. As a matter of fact, I sold a house. One of my investor clients had two properties. He had to move out of one property back into his other property because of his children's school needs. And it's the only way he was able to solve it.
Okay. All right, next question. What is blockbusting?
Right. Blockbusting, similar to steering in some ways. It's basically you're convincing a seller to sell based on the fact that a certain ethnicity has moved into the neighborhood, and you're creating a panic situation in them. You better sell now based on this happening. But again, it's based on race and something that you would want to stay away from. You're not involved in those situations. You're there to sell a house regardless, right? You're there to buy a house regardless based on the needs of your clients. But blockbusting would be creating hysteria with somebody based on a certain ethnicity buying in the area.
That makes sense. Okay, next one, the Unrule Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, that's a California. The first one we talked about, the federal fair housing, was a federal. This is a California anti-discrimination based on the same criteria that we talked about: race, religion, sexual orientation, and those issues. But it's on a California level.
Okay, that makes sense. Pat, in your 30 years plus of doing this, how many times have you run into any issues with any of these things we just talked about?
This discrimination issues, personally, me, one time I was representing a couple, black gentleman, his wife was a British woman, okay? And it was in a lease situation. The landlord wanted to meet my clients, and everything seemed to be fine. Now, I can't prove what I'm about to tell you, but I went with them to meet the landlord to do a meet and greet. We hadn't signed on the bottom line yet. And when I met the landlord, who wasn't white herself, she was of a different ethnicity, I could tell her whole body language changed. Now, I can't tell you it was because he was black and she was white, the wife, but I certainly got an instinctual feeling that this landlord changed what she was telling me via email and verbally upon meeting this gentleman. And I voiced that to my client, and I said, you've seen the emails, and I've been telling you what she's been telling me. That meeting that we just had went very, very different. Now, and I don't know why it went different, but I don't really trust what I just heard from her. So, and I felt she was making a value judgment based on this gentleman being black. That was my instinct. Can I prove it? Did she say that? No, but her whole tune changed very differently upon meeting this family. It was a lovely family. That she was a husband and wife, 3 beautiful kids, but her whole demeanor changed. It was an instinct. She didn't put anything in writing to me why she rejected him and didn't voice it, but it seemed pretty clear to me. That's the only instance that's come up. And I've been in the business 30 years in some capacity for another, I should say. But that was the only time that I got the hair on the back of my neck stood up a little bit based on I felt she was being discriminatory.
Well, that's pretty good. 30 years ago, we have one incident. That's a good record there. That's
Yeah.
good to know. I'm glad to know that all these things are in place and it kind of keeps everybody on the straight and narrow. So that's a good thing. All right, so let's move on to chapter number. I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, what I was saying is they're meant to, but we're dealing with human beings, right? And and you know, human beings have their own prejudice in some regard, whatever it may be. You know, could be, I don't know, to the wind blowing. I don't know, but yeah, these things are put in place for very specific reasons and good reasons. So yeah, and they're, like I said, we have a federal guideline on this and a California guideline on this specifically for these things.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. All right, next chapter, chapter number 8. This chapter is headed the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. Okay, so the first question is the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. What is that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the largest civil rights agency against discrimination. Okay, that was put in place, I believe, back in the 60s or late 50s or something like that. But again, it has to do with the same thing: civil rights with regards to discrimination based on the race, religion, sexual orientation, and those issues.
Okay, so this seems to be more of a specific thing for California, I guess.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So this next thing I have here just says discriminatory practices. Mm-hmm. So what are we mindful of as a real estate agent when you go out there? What do we have to be, you know, watching? I mean, from what I'm understanding now, there's a lot of certain, I mean, not a lot, but there seems to be certain things that we kind of can't talk about. So I would imagine probably discriminatory practices probably has to do with maybe that angle of thinking.
Right. I mean, if your client were to say to you, Patrick or Mark, I don't want you to bring me Asian buyers or Persian buyers, black buyers, white buyers, whatever. You cannot be engaged in those conversations. I mean, if they're that way, that's what I'm saying. You may not want to be even working with those folks. I mean, if they want to open themselves up to a lawsuit, you don't want to be involved with that. You cannot represent that. These guidelines are put in place to prevent these things from happening. I mean, could I have prevented that landlord? Like I said, she didn't put anything in writing or say to me, Patrick, I'm not taking your client because he's a black guy. But her whole demeanor changed when they met in person, which gave me the heebie-jeebies. Okay. And I took them somewhere else because I just got a really bad vibe on the energy that was taking place. You know, I'm in a deal right now, on a buy deal right now, 2 offers going out, and my instinct tells me what's going to happen on this deal. And how can I tell you that? I can only tell you that because I've been fully immersed in deals for 30 years, and I kind of have an instinct about things. You know, I've seen things unfold a certain way, right? So it's an instinct that you get when you're involved in multiple deals and when you're dealing with people so much. You just get these specific instincts about things that are happening, right? But so a discriminatory practice, I mean, that's the example that I gave you is the best one that I can think of, right? That I can viscerally remember feeling, I believe she's changing her tune because she met my client and he's black and she has some specific prejudice against black people, right? I mean, that's what I felt. Can I prove it? No, but I really felt that because it materially changed from what she was telling me on his financial qualification and the family qualification and what she was looking for her house, that she changed when she met them.
Have you ever had to step away from the deal, people where you felt like they were walking a line of discrimination? Besides the one you're talking about, I mean?
No, I've never had it come up other than that situation. And in that situation, I found them a different property. Right. I took them to a different property and found them a different property. But I've never had somebody that I was representing overtly say to me, don't bring me this, don't bring me that, don't bring me, and then I walked away from it. It's not, I've not been in those situations.
Well, yeah, that's good to hear. Well, hopefully it's like maybe the color of money is more important than the color of that person.
Yes, yes.
To these people, I would think, right?
Right.
All right, so let's move on to chapter number 9 here. A lot of this stuff, we seem to be kind of hammering home the same kind of information. A lot of it was about, anti-discrimination and those kinds of things. But I guess, I still want to get your point of view on this because you have real world experience with all this. Okay, so chapter 9, the heading for this one is called the Housing Financial Discrimination Act of 1977. Okay, the first question is, what is redlining?
Redlining, right. Redlining, it's not something that we deal with so much from an agent capacity. It's a little bit more lender specific.
Okay.
Redlining. It's if a lender was to discriminate based on race in a specific area, okay, they'd be redlining, right? So they're not allowed to do that, right? They're not allowed to make a lending guideline out of reach for a specific area, saying this area is inherently white, this area is inherently black, so I'm not going to lend to that area. It's more of a lender guideline. That's what redlining would be. Kind of putting a red line around an area and saying, I'm not lending there based on these guidelines, which would be sex, sexual orientation, race, religion, whatever that may be.
Okay, so this is more of a thing of keeping the lenders in line then, right?
Correct.
Okay. I have something written here. I'm not quite sure why I have this, but I want to ask you about it. Purchase assist financing. What does that mean?
Purchase assist financing. Can you give me an example where it was?
I have it written down. Let me see if I can find it here.
It seems like a grant or monies that would be advanced for example, like a VA, Veterans Administration, the VA loan. VA loans are 100% financing. Most real estate deals, you have to bring some skin in the game, right? Whether it's 5% down, FHA would be 3.5% down, 10% down, 20%. For years in America, you couldn't buy a house unless you had 20% down. That changed when those guidelines changed. It first went to 80-10-10 financing. You financed 80%, you put 10% down, and you got a secondary financing of 10% on the purchase, right? Okay. Well, that changed the lending world a lot. Most people needed 20% down regardless, but that changed. They had to open up the market for other buyers. So all these other programs came into effect. What you're saying, I'm not familiar with. It must have something to do with assistance like that, some grant or.
Yeah, it's not specific. That's why I asked you about it in this chapter, because it only states that purchase assist financing one time. Maybe this is just kind of like foreshadowing something, letting me get you kind of understand. Here's something, we don't explain it yet. Probably the next couple chapters we'll get to it, but I think you're probably on the right path about it, where because they do start to talk about things more about those kind of loans, the FHA loans and things like that.
Got it.
Okay, so all right, next chapter, Equal Credit Opportunity Act. What is that, Pat?
That's again, it's a lender issue. Again, more on the lending side, and again, it's around discrimination. They can, based on reason that credit was not extended to somebody, would be based on race, religion, sexual orientation, so forth. A lender cannot discriminate based on that. You would have to show why, they were not given the opportunity to get the credit, and it could not have been for those reasons. It would have to be a real material reason. Not enough income, credit's not good enough, not enough assets. It has to be a real reason. You cannot discriminate based on race, sexual orientation, religion, for those reasons. But it's more lender specific. No, it doesn't come back around in our world.
Okay, so this seems like what they're trying to get us to understand here in the book, up to these chapters now, is that as far as discrimination is concerned, there are things in place that federally are there, for the state are there, on both sides of the fence, for real estate brokers and agents to pay attention to, and also for lenders to pay attention to. So that's where they're kind of making this separation of both of these kind of understandings, I think. So that's what I'm getting from that. Does that make sense?
Exactly. I mean, it would come up in our world if one of our clients who may be in a minority group came back and said, well, Patrick, you said if I had enough income, you said if I had W-2 verifiable income, my credit was in the top tier of lending, and I had enough assets to buy a house, I can. Well, I've given all of those things to this lender, and he's still telling me I cannot get a loan. I'm getting a bad feeling about this based on the fact that I'm in a minority group, right? I've never had it happen, but the guideline is in place stating you cannot discriminate against any minority group based on this federal lending guideline, right? So it's in place on their level as well.
Okay, that makes sense. To that, I wanted to ask a question, because currently, because of COVID being what it is, have you noticed that the lending process has gotten more difficult?
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about that? Like, how is it? How, in what ways has it changed?
From a risk standpoint, from a lender's, people losing their jobs, for example, people being, I'll give you a real life example. I was, about 2 months ago, I was in LA helping a first time buyer, and he was in the hospitality business. And his fiance was in marketing, online marketing. Well, during the process of going, finding houses, when we found a house, that day he lost his job. He got put on, what would you say?
Furlough
or something, right? But but in his situation, they laid everyone off. So he literally was laid off. So when you're getting a loan, you'll give the lender everything he needs to qualify you. One of the things that lenders do, they're calling the HR department in the beginning to make sure you work there, halfway into the deal to make sure you're still working there, and before they even fund the loan, they're going to call the HR department again to make sure you're still working there. Well, as soon as he lost his job, even though he had money in the bank and it looked like he'd probably get rehired on once the economy opened up again, and I knew we were dead in the water. We were basically a sailboat sitting in the ocean with no wind because he had no job. I mean, even though a job you could lose your job in a month from now after you bought the house, but the lenders don't look at it that way. If you've been working at a place for 2 years and you've established employment history, they look at it from today's standpoint. So the COVID has complicated it because of the uncertainty. When is the economy going to open up again? And so lenders are also considering that, because keep in mind, when a lender originates a loan, they don't keep that loan. They sell the loan on the secondary market to get their money back, right? They sell it to another investor who will bundle it, and then they throw it out there and sell it multiple times. And that's the way they keep washing the money to keep the money flow working. So COVID has complicated it just based on the uncertainty when everybody is going to get back to work, when the economy is going to open up. So a lot of the investors they have different loan programs out there for different folks. Well, a lot of the loans that were out there, let's say there's 10 different types, maybe half of them went away because they perceive those half to be too risky now, based on the uncertainty in the economy. And the same thing happened during the short sale days when the whole global economy melted down back in 2008. Lending back then was just excruciating to try and get people qualified, because they only wanted the best of the best of the best of the best people to be buying houses, because the whole housing market went up in smoke.
Are we seeing that happen again?
Well, COVID is the sort of event that typically you would see tip a market, a high impact, unexpected event. That's a black swan event. Typically, those sort of events tip our market. to the downside. Now, our market in California, for example, has been moving to the upside for the last 7 years. Since 2013, we came out of the short sale days and we started moving up. So, and the reason I know this is because the data tells us that now, but I was in the market with a lot of buyers at that time. And all of a sudden, the market just went boop, like this. We were submitting offers, and all of a sudden, offers started going up, because so many people were jumping in, right? And then the government was manipulating rates, pushing rates down on interest rates on loans. So the market just tipped up, and then it just kept going. And in California, we typically see 7-year trends. It's not spot on, but typically that's what we see. 7 up, 7 down. Well, right now in 2020, we're in year 7. 13, it started like 13, so 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So 7 years right now, we're into an uptrend. So you would think if something as big and impactful as COVID hit, that's a black swan event, it should tip our market down. But rates are being kept very, very low. And inventory is still a little bit tight. So the market continues to move.
Okay.
There's a lot of different things nowadays that used to be stock market would go up, real estate would go down. Real estate would go up, right? Stock market would go down. That's how it worked for a long time. But now, you know, mortgage-backed securities are linked now with all the hedge fund companies that are buying big bundles of loans. So we're now linked to the stock market. So the market is, there's outside forces in the background constantly keeping our market somewhat level. Will it correct? It will correct. They always do. Historically, if you look at 100 years worth of a real estate market in the US, we always have uptrends, downtrends, uptrends, downtrends. We're just going to have to see where we go from here out of COVID. Hopefully we'll get through this after the Southern Hemisphere comes out of it, their winter, and we'll see where, if it comes back through America, we'll see. And we'll just, the jobs are the key to any real estate market, right?
Right.
If we have no jobs, if everyone's losing their job, no one can buy a house. I mean, that's the end of the story. Jobs control things. So we'll see how we go.
Okay, you talked earlier about a short sale. Can you talk more specifically about what a short sale is?
Short sale, they have been around for a long time. I mean, you know, back in 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, they dominated the market. Just means this: I bought a house for $1 million. I had an $800,000 loan on it. The market corrected and my $1 million house went to 700,000, but my loan is still 800,000. So my loan is more than the house is worth. There's a shortage there. So my house is now worth 700. I have an $800,000 loan against it. So there's a $100,000 shortage if I were to sell my house. So the lender would have to agree to the short sale, meaning they would have to eat the 100,000. Now, when short sales evolved, it went like this. If I had a $100,000 loss, they would issue me basically a 1099 debt forgiveness on that 100,000, and I would have to pay tax on that. But when the economy was imploding, if someone had to short sell their house, they were under financial distress. So did they have 15%, 20% to pay taxes on that 100,000? They didn't have 10 cents to remedy their house payment. So then the guideline changed that it was going to be complete debt forgiveness. That I had to sell my house at $100,000 shortage. The bank could issue a 1099, but I didn't have to pay tax on it. It was just wiped clean. I still had a short sale on my record, which is not much different than a foreclosure. It's still a ding on your credit, and you wouldn't be able to buy a house for 4 years after you had a short sale on your record. But you could after 4 years. It would still show, but they would say enough time has gone by and we can't hold that against you since you short sold your house 4 years ago based on the economy and the fact you lost your job or whatever it was. But that's a long-winded explanation to what a short sale is. Just basically a differential between the house value and what's owed against the house currently.
Are short sales still apart? Are still happening today?
Every once in a while, they're not a dominant player in the market.
Okay.
Not right now, because the market's been moving to the positive side for 7 years.
Okay.
So we came out of that. You know, if the house was worth 600, those houses that were worth 600 are now at 850. So the prices have gone up again, and when they're in a positive situation to selling. A lot of people had to wait that out, especially people that bought in 2005 and 6 when the market was peaking last, and then it went down from 6 to 13, and then they had to wait for it to climb back out, and now they're selling. I see a lot of those folks selling right now.
So it obviously has to be a possibility that if COVID does what it's doing and gets worse, short sales might become a new thing in the next 3, 4, 5 years.
100% they will.
100% they will. That's a guarantee, Pat.
That's a pretty bold statement, right?
Yeah.
I do these seminars.
I make my Karnak thing here that says, Pat says.
Yeah. Well, these two posters that I have behind me, Make the Decision, are real estate seminars that I run for investors to buy second properties, investment properties. I have a lot of investors that have 5, 6, 7 properties. So I represent that clientele. And these seminars are based on this 7-year trend that I mentioned,
Right.
That if the market tips down, you may want to get your money reserves ready to go and jump back into this market to buy depressed markets, depressed properties in the market. But there's no evidence of that right now. But obviously, if a black swan event goes on and on and on and on, and jobs are being lost, there's always people that have to sell houses. It's not just job loss. It's a death. It's a divorce. Forced to sell, right? They don't want to sell, but they're forced to sell. So if somebody is forced to sell and no one is around to buy, then they just got to keep riding the price down, down, down until someone will buy. Because there's a dynamic in the market that's always inherent in the market. There are people that are sitting on their hands with a whole lot of money that just keep perceiving the sky is going to fall. And those people come out of the woodwork when the market does fall. And they're cash heavy, and they're very tough to compete with because they're either all cash buyers or 50% LTV or lower. So
what do you mean by LTV?
LTV means loan to value. So
Okay.
like I mentioned, in America, for the longest time, you could only buy a house if you had 20% down. So that would be 80% LTV, loan to value. So if I'm buying $1 million house, 800,000 is the loan to value, right?
Okay.
80% LTV of $1 million. So there's always someone that has to buy a house and always someone that has to sell a house, regardless of the market, hot or not, right? The market's hot right now. I'm working with a lot of buyers. I have someone coming out of state that's moving $22 million to California to push it around in multiple properties.
Wow.
So there's always somebody looking to buy and always someone looking to sell. It may not be the best time to sell. So if it's not the best time to sell and they have to sell, the price has to come down. And that's what would tip a market. But we're not in that market right now. The market is still holding up.
So far.
So far. Always so far.
Right. Okay, this next question for number 10. This is when they first start to mention the Federal Housing Administration. So what can you tell me about the Federal Housing Administration?
Right. Well, the FHA, we refer to it as the FHA, federal level. So they insure loans, right? They insure loans for lenders. So if the loan goes bad, they'll step in and compensate the lender monetarily. And they also buy loans, right? So if somebody is procuring an FHA-backed loan, they have to adhere to the guideline that FHA uses to purchase those loans. There may be specific guidelines, different guidelines than a non-FHA loan. Basically, they're the Federal Housing Authority in America.
Okay. Well, I've heard of FHA loans before. Do they offer different criteria that makes it easier to buy a house?
Um, for example, FHA loans, I think the minimum requirement as of right now, the minimum down payment on an FHA loan on certain loan amounts would be 3.5% down.
Oh,
And
wow.
like I mentioned, for years you could only buy a house in America with 20% down. Then 80-10-10 came into effect, and then straight 90% loans came into effect, and then 95% LTV came into effect where you had to put 5%. Then FHA dropped their limit to 3.5% down to try and stimulate the housing market. But they are a little, again, if you're going to get an FHA loan with 3.5% down, there are a lot of other guidelines in effect. I don't know that it would be considered easier. In many cases, they're a little bit more expensive because you have to carry private mortgage insurance, also known as PMI, on that upper 15% of the loan, right? Because if the market corrects, it could correct up to 15-20%. So at that point, that loan is underwater. So, but if you have PMI in effect, that offers insurance on that upper 15% if that loan had to be sold.
Okay. What's the percentage of the PMI insurance? How much money is that typically?
Uh, it's basically an insurance policy you're purchasing through the lender for that, and that could add $200, $300 to your payment every month based on the insurance, right? And there are some PMIs that once you get sufficient equity in your property, there may be a guideline on the PMI that says it has to be in effect for 3 years, 5 years. Some of it could be the life of the loan, right? But there are some guidelines that state if you have sufficient equity, you can request that the PMI be removed. Many loans, they won't remove it on FHA stuff. It has to be in effect the whole time. It's just they're basically just hedging.
Yeah, it makes sense. Something about that where they said that what you were talking about, where at a certain year, if you had built equity, you could stop the PMI.
Right. Yes, you have to go through the process to make that happen. The lender would require an appraisal to make sure you're giving accurate information. That, hey, listen, when I bought the house, it was 600. I believe the house is now worth 800. Why am I carrying PMI insurance when the house is way in excess of what I purchased? I've got skin in the game. I have a lot of equity in the house. I'm in a net equity situation, so I'm requesting that it be removed, but they would require that, you pay for an appraisal and goes through the process of trusting but verifying that.
Okay, makes sense. All right, next chapter. It's called Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. Okay, so the first question I have from that chapter is, you mentioned debt, LTV, is that how you said it?
Yeah, I said
loan to value.
Correct. That's LTV. What's your loan to value?
Okay, this next one is called debt to income ratio.
Right, your debt to income ratio.
It's kind of or what do they call that? Is there an acronym for that?
DTI, yeah, just debt to income.
Okay.
DTI. So basically, it's just your debt to income ratio. How much debt do you have in comparison to how much income you have every month, right? Most lenders run from about, again, because this is more of a lender thing, not our agent thing.
Okay.
But the guideline basically now is 36% DTI. You don't want to have more than 36%, debt to income for you to get qualification. And they have a front-end DTI and a back-end DTI with lenders, okay? You could have a 36% front end and a 41% back end, right? Factoring in more debt. They'll allow more debt for a back end than a front end. But it has to do with a lender qualification. And because I don't swim in the lending world, I have the best lenders that I engage in the business. I let them work on that.
Okay.
I just advise my clients based on the trifecta that we always talk about. How much money do you have to put down? Do you make W-2 income, verifiable income? And how's your credit? You want to keep these things in check. And once we're buying, you put a freeze on all of those things. Don't go out and put $1,000 on your credit card or $2,000 on your credit card or go to Vegas because you could throw your DTI out, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lender could have qualified you. Now you went out and you bought a piano for $7,000 on a credit card and you've thrown out your DTI ratios. You're now carrying too much debt and you won't get the loan. That's my counsel to my clients all the time. Once we're buying property, put your financial life on hold. Don't go buy a car. Don't buy a piano. Just stay the course until we're done and we close the transaction, then go out and put some money on your credit.
Okay. Pat, just ancillary to that, how fast, or what's the time frame that it takes to get qualified for a loan?
Well,
if all those three factors are if they're all in good shape, so like you said,
right.
Credit, you've got W-2 income, you've got enough for the down payment. Say all those factors are taken care of. What's the average time it takes to get qualified?
Right. Well, a lender can qualify you based on getting specific components that I just mentioned from you, your W-2s, your tax returns, your bank statements, running your credit. They can get you pre-qualified in a short amount of time. If they're a very purchase-specific lender, that can happen in a couple of days. Now, full qualification is a whole different ballgame because that has to go to underwriting, has to go to secondary underwriting. You also have to get a property and you have to get an appraisal on the property. So those are two components to the full qualification process. But a pre-qualification can take place in a rapid time, 2 to 3 days.
Okay. When you say underwriting processes, what do you mean by that?
Well, the underwriter works with the lender and they're part of the lending team. Keep in mind that lender, that broker is not going to keep that loan. They're going to originate the loan based on, their warehouse line of money. If they're a warehouse lender, they have basically a big chunk of money, $20 million, $30 million, whatever it may be. And they're going to take that money, lend it, and then they're going to take that loan based on the underwriting guidelines on the loan. Is their DTI in line? What's their credit? What's their income? What's their DTI? All of the guidelines, because they're going to sell that loan to an investor. And that underwriter who's underwriting it has to be able to sell that, right, to warrant that, right? So they're part of the lending team.
Okay, why did you do underwriting processes that you went through?
Say that one more time.
Why did you say there were two underwriting
processes? Right, because multiple times, a lot of loans are subject to secondary underwriting, right? They'll go to underwriting and they'll review the file and it will check out. And then once they get the full component in effect, everything in, they may have an underwriter have a quick look at the file, right? And go, yeah, it's fine. But I still need all of these other components to really drill down on things, right? Okay. And so it'll go back to underwriting for a second review.
Okay. So there's a lot of checks and balances going on with this process.
Lots. And like I said, the work component is key because they're calling HR day 1, day 15, and the day you close escrow, they're calling to make sure you're still working there. It's a trust but verify right up to the 11th hour.
Well, that makes sense, especially now with things being moved there with COVID, because people are losing their jobs left and right.
Right.
Who knows the timing of it? I mean, we just got done closing down in California again, so that's going to affect a lot of people's jobs.
Yes.
Okay, next thing here, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. What is that?
Basically, again, it's a lender component. Those things that we just talked about, it's a checks and balances thing. Lenders are required to keep certain records for a certain amount of time for certain key things. If files are audited by the authority, right? If they say, okay, we want to see the records of your file for those 5 loans that you originated, where's all the documentation for that? It's a lender component that they must keep their records for a certain amount of time.
Oh, okay. Makes sense. All right, Pat. Well, that gets us to the end of chapter 11 for all of our questions. I know you mentioned that you wanted to talk about the RPA.
Yes. Very briefly.
You wanted to get into that?
Yeah, the main workings of of a real estate deal are the contract that we use. Okay, and we refer to it as the RPA, which stands for Residential Purchase Agreement. Okay, that's our contract. In California, it used to be a 1 to 2 page document. Now it's a 10-page document, full of legalese, full of everything you would expect to see in a contract: performance and remedy provisions, contingency provisions. I mean, for a buyer, there's basically 3 big contingencies. One is inspection contingency. The contract defaults to 17 days. We generally push that down to 10 days because we can get inspections done within 10 days. The second provision, if you're financing, which most people are, is the appraisal contingency. That happens in 17 days, sometimes 10 days. And then full loan approval, which contract provision calls for, is 21 days. That can also be shortened too, depending how confident you are that your buyer is going to be rock solid approved, right? But the reason you have an appraisal for 17 days and full loan approval at 21 days, the appraisal is part of the qualification process. So that appraisal has to come in first, get submitted to the lender to underwriting, the house appraised for what we're purchasing it for, then they can give full loan approval 3 days later. So the purchase agreement is something we can dive down into. I'll send it to you. One day we'll do a call just on the RPA. Okay. That would be a really beneficial call for you because that's going to be your working contract, right? And I would recommend as a part of your learning process that you go through the RPA and you look at what provision 14 is, provision 3, what all of these key provisions are, and how they work in a real world, because they're very, very important that you know that RPA inside and outside.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's 10 pages long?
Yes.
Okay. How much of that is actually, in effect on a typical deal? Like, I mean, as I've looked at some of these different disclosures and documents I've seen, a lot of it seems pretty self-explanatory, but some of the stuff when you're looking at a page is like, okay, well, there's like 7 things I don't need to be concerned about. This is the one thing we need to be concerned. That's this, and then you're half the page done. You know what I mean? So it seems like there's a lot of checks and balances, which makes sense. But on a typical deal where everything is solid, so your buyer is solid, the seller is solid, everything is good as far as everything matching up numbers wise. How much of the 10 pages are you going to have to really be specific about?
It's a good question. The reason it went from 1 page to 10 pages is because of lawsuits.
Right.
So it's important that you have a working understanding of all of the provisions. How many of them come into play on the contract? Obviously, they all do, whether they're going on in the background or not. But the key provisions are the 3 that I just mentioned to you: the inspection contingency, appraisal contingency, and full loan approval, right? Those are key because they're performance driven. They call out that they must happen on these days, and then the agent must notice you to remove those things once those time frames come and go, because they're not passive removal, they're active removal. See, once we reach mutual agreement on a contract and you're the seller, I'm the buyer, and you and I reach mutual agreement, okay, that takes place today. We have 3 business days for me as the buyer to deliver my deposit. If I have a contract that says I got $25,000 deposit, I have 3 business days to wire that to escrow. That's the first provision on the contract that's due to the buyer, right? That must take place. If I don't deposit that money within 3 days, the contract is voidable because it's a performance provision. States I must wire that money within 3 days. So that's another important one, right? If you have inspection, you have appraisal, you have full loan approval, the performance on getting the deposit within 3 business days. Now keep in mind, if we're in a 30-day deal, that's 30 linear days, but you have business days. And so if we reach mutual agreement on a Friday, Saturday and Sunday don't count as business days. So my Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday would be my third business day that the money have to go into escrow. Even though those 2 days will count as contract days, they're not business days. Also on performance dates on contracts, you cannot be noticed on a performance day if it is a non-business day. So if I have a contingency removal that is happening on day 10 and day 10 falls on a Saturday, it doesn't have to be removed until the next business day, which is Monday. That has to do with performance days.
Okay, but the contract time will still be the same though, right?
That's correct. Contract days will
So
continue.
there's business days, there's contract days. Business days include all weekends, all holidays. Business days are just the Monday through Friday.
Yes, correct.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, I was looking online trying to find an RPA for myself to kind of look at, because I think I remember from previous conversations you're talking about that's something you really want to be well versed in. You want to know that like you know your social security number or your birth date or whatever. It's something you want to be able to look over and kind of go, yes, I know all of these, I know exactly what they mean. And if you look at a contract and something's missing, you should know, okay, that's going to be whatever section this and that's that. I know what that is, right? So yeah, I think it's a good idea, Pat, if we go over that. Maybe we can do that next week on this. We can do the RPA instead of the next chapters. If that sounds good to you.
You got it.
I think that deserves a deep dive into it and go into everything for sure.
Sounds good. That's an exciting thing.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, so we'll plan for that for next week, and then we'll continue with the chapters 12 through probably like whatever we get to. I'm going to try to, some of these chapters are fairly short, and some of them, like I said, this was a weird week for us because I think these chapters all kind of pretty much hinged around the same idea of discrimination from the broker's point of view, and then from the broker and agent, and then also from the lender's point of view. So I think that's pretty much how this kind of delineates itself for me, is understanding the separation there. And they all just kind of seem to make common sense. It's like you don't want to be dealing with people who are having these kind of ethics, and you obviously don't want to possess those kinds of ethics when you go into being, an agent.
Correct. And yes, exactly. And like I said, you're in the process now of learning a language, and that language is real estate. And you want to be licensed, so you need to understand all this information for licensing reasons, right? These chapters that you're talking about are extremely important on a human level and an ethical level. And you asked me how has it come up in my career? Well, I gave you one example over decades, right? And that was an instinct feeling. I can't prove it. It was an instinct, but I felt that they're important. That to learn about the Unrule Act and the Federal Fair Housing Act. These are test passing questions. You need to know them for those reasons. Will they come up? Very rarely.
I hope so. I hope it's non-existent.
Yes.
But it sounds like from your experience that's probably a likely outcome, because you've been doing it for 30 years. I would think that if this was something that was more common, that you probably would have run into more than one instance that you could recall right off the bat. So that's a good thing to know. But like I said, I understand, you're right. These are things you have to know for the test. There are things that you should understand. We have things in place in our industry that can help us to understand how this works. And you might have some, if ever you came up on an incident where you needed it, you'd have recourse. So it's good to have that. Understand.
Correct. 100%.
All right, brother. Well, thank you so much, man. That brings us right about to an hour. We're at like 58 minutes here. I think we did
very good.
Thank you so much, Pat. You are. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, because I just have to ask the questions, and you just get to go and just give me all the knowledge, and I love that.
I like to give you real life examples too, how things will work, or they kind of will work, right? It's an instinct. When you get into full immersion stuff, you develop a flow and an instinct how things tend to go, right? And if you have a passion for it, it's even that much better.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad it's helpful for you, because I think the real life examples will help you a lot. Knowing the details of what you're studying right now are really important, like I said, from an ethical standpoint, human standpoint, but getting how things work. Once you hit the pool swimming and racing, you don't know how fast the competition is until you hit that water and you go, right? So I think hopefully these stories will help you.
Oh, they've helped out immensely, man. It's great just talking to you about this. It gives me, it inspires me in a lot of different ways. It's just kind of, it's a weird thing because, you know, when you're in the curriculum and you're reading all these chapters, your head is swimming with all of this information that's very theoretical, and you know, you're looking at terminology and all the different ways that they might explain things to you. But when I talk to you, it's like, oh, that's really what that boils down to. I've just read 5 pages on this whole thing that kind of has my head kind of going in all different directions. And you go, well, Mark, it's like this. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that makes it a lot more simple. You know, I do understand that there are going to be things on a test that are going to come up, and I'm going to go like, okay, but it'll be like in the real world, when I get out there and do a deal, I'll be like, oh, Pat told me about this. Dude, I can't work with you. You're a racist. I'm sorry. I gotta go.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna go to my car. I'll be right back in 20 years.
Yes, exactly. Exit stage right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, Pat. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out. We'll see you next week. We'll continue with, actually, we're going to continue next week with a deep dive into the RPA, or the Residential Purchase Agreement, and talk about that with Pat next week. Okay, everybody?
That'll be great.
Okay, Pat, thank you for everything. Have a great week, sir. Go out there and, you know, get all the deals. Get all the deals.
Get all the deals. You got it,
Yeah.
sir. You have a positive week too. I'll talk to you next week.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Take care.
Bye-bye.